The quiet night nurse kept her head down during Cedar Creek Medical's graveyard shifts. Nobody noticed her. That was precisely the point. She moved through the ER like someone who understood that visibility was a liability, that drawing attention was a rookie mistake, that the best operators were the ones nobody remembered seeing at all. They didn't know she was tracking exits. They didn't know her eyes recorded security patterns the way a camera records light, automatic, constant, archived in a part of her brain trained by 16 months in Bagram to process threat vectors while her hands performed routine nursing tasks. Hannah Clarke arrived at 2,145 hours through the employee entrance on the north side of Cedar Creek Medical, the Denver night pressing down cold and clear above the parking lot. Her badge, the official one, the civilian one, read RN, Emergency Department. The second badge, the one in a locked drawer at her apartment, read Captain, United States Army Special Forces. She carried neither with ceremony. She carried them both like truths that couldn't coexist in the same room. The ER smelled the way it always did at the start of a night shift, antiseptic layered over the faint copper of old blood, the particular staleness of a building that never quite aired out. She moved through the automatic doors and clocked in at the station without speaking to the charge nurse, who was already drowning in paperwork from the evening disaster, 3 motor vehicle accidents, 1 cardiac arrest that had been brought back, 2 pediatric asthma exacerbations. Hannah glanced at the patient board and catalogued the acuity in the same way a tactical officer catalogues a hostile environment. High risk, 3 beds. Moderate risk, 7 beds. Stable, 11 beds. The real patient, the one she was actually here to monitor, was 3 floors up in the ICU. She poured coffee in the break room, watching the liquid cascade into a chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. The fluorescent lights above her hummed their endless fluorescent hum, and she stood motionless for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Muscle memory. Back in Bagram, silence was danger. Noise meant routine. Routine meant you could move freely. The lights hummed on. The coffee machine gurgled. The refrigerator clicked and cycled. All of it was exactly as it should be. She took her coffee to the staff bathroom and locked the door behind her. From her locker, she unfolded a small flag, precisely folded, creased like the kind you saw at Arlington on certain solemn days. The colors had faded in 2 years. Red still holding red. White still holding white. But the blue had gone the color of old denim, the edges soft from being touched. She held it for exactly 60 seconds without moving, without breathing past a shallow place in her chest, then folded it back into its precise triangles and locked it away again. The ritual never changed. Every shift. 60 seconds. No more. No less. Vulnerability had a schedule. By 0200 hours, she was at the nurse's station logging medication times with the kind of precision that should have flagged something to anyone paying attention. But nobody paid attention to Hannah Clarke. That was the operational requirement. She moved like someone who had learned to be invisible in a place where being visible could get you killed. Her hands flew across the keyboard, medication names, times, doses, patient responses. Each entry was exact. Each detail documented with the care of someone who understood that precision mattered, that accuracy could mean the difference between a life saved and a life lost, that details were intelligence. At 02 for 5 hours, she rode the elevator to ICU bed 347 where her target lay recovering from what the hospital believed was acute poisoning. What the Pentagon knew was something else entirely. The patient's name was classified. His significance was not. He had worked for the agency for 23 years before someone decided his knowledge had become inconvenient. The poisoning had been strategic. The hospital had been recommended by people whose names never appeared in any official capacity. Hannah had been placed here to watch him recover and to monitor who came to visit. The ICU was quieter than the ER, a different kind of quiet, the kind where machines did most of the talking. The ventilator beside bed 347 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in and out, the sound of artificially maintained breath. The monitors displayed numbers that told a story: BP 118/72, heart rate 62, O2 sat 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Stable. Recovering. The patient's eyes were closed. Hannah checked his 4 sites with the attention of someone who had been trained to notice when things were placed wrong, who understood the vulnerability of exposed medical access, who knew that the simplest ports of entry were sometimes the most dangerous. She documented her observations in his chart, another entry in a series of entries that would go nowhere, filed away in the normal course of medical record keeping, invisible to everyone except the Pentagon liaison who would review them each week using a phone number that existed in no directory. 12 years of this work. 3 separate deployments. 2 false identities as civilian healthcare workers. And now this, a nurse in Denver, watching a man recover from assassination, understanding that the recovery was only half the battle. The patient's sister had visited yesterday. Hannah had memorized her face, her vehicle license plate number, the time of her arrival and departure. 47 minutes. Long enough for conversation. Not long enough for passing physical objects. She had documented this in the confidential channel. The liaison would handle it. She descended back to the ER just after 0300 hours, and that was when the doors opened and Dr. Mercer arrived for his overnight supervisory rounds. His shoes, expensive leather, probably Italian, definitely over $2,000, clicked against the linoleum with each step. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the department like a precision tool. Everything about him announced hierarchy, the way he held his tablet, the way his eyes scanned the station for incompetence, the way his chin angled slightly upward as he moved through the floor. He paused at the nurse's station and read over Hannah's shoulder without asking permission. She felt his presence like a barometric pressure change, the way the air felt different before a thunderstorm rolled in. His contempt was visible in the way his lip curled slightly as he reviewed her charting, in the way he exhaled through his nose like something smelled bad. Vitals logged at 0247 on the patient in Trauma Bay 2, he said, his voice carrying the kind of refined disdain that could only come from people who had never doubted themselves. That's 8 minutes before the order to check them. That's called working outside your scope, Miss Clarke. Hannah continued typing. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle in her cheek tensing for 1/2 second, then releasing. Her hands remained steady on the keyboard. She had not flinched. She had not frozen. She had absorbed information and filed it away in the same manner she had learned to absorb the screams of dying soldiers without letting them alter her medical decision-making. The patient was symptomatic, she said quietly. Tachycardia. Pallor. I anticipated the order. Anticipated, Mercer repeated, and the word sounded obscene in his mouth. He turned to face her fully now, and Hannah could see the muscles in his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. You anticipated. That's what we call playing doctor when you're a nurse. Do you understand the distinction? Hannah did not respond immediately. She had learned, years ago in a classroom at Fort Bragg where they taught you how to move through enemy territory without being detected, that sometimes the most devastating weapon was silence. Silence made people talk. Silence made them fill the void with their own rage. Silence was a tactic. She turned from the keyboard and looked at him directly. Her eyes were the color of aged bronze, unusual enough that people remembered them when they tried to describe her later, though she never gave them the chance to do much talking. She had been trained to look through people, not at them. But now she was choosing to look, choosing to meet his gaze with the kind of flat, measured calm that came from understanding that his authority was institutional while hers was something else entirely. I understood the clinical presentation required immediate assessment, she said. 10 words. Exactly. Professional. Deferential. The voice of someone who was accepting correction. It won't happen again, doctor. Mercer's nostrils flared. He had wanted her to argue. He had wanted the confrontation. Instead, she had given him nothing, no emotional reaction, no defensive justification, no rebellion. The absence of reaction was somehow more infuriating to him than any argument would have been. He could fight someone who pushed back. He could destroy someone who challenged him. But someone who simply absorbed his contempt and continued their work? That was something he couldn't quite get purchase on. "See that it doesn't," he said finally, and his shoes clicked away toward the trauma bays where real work awaited, work that required his superior intellect and surgical hand. Hannah returned to her charting. Her heart rate remained exactly 62 beats per minute. Her breathing remained shallow and controlled. The tremor in her left hand, the old shrapnel injury, the one that sometimes decided to remind her of Bagram at the most inconvenient moments, did not appear. She had locked that away too, the same way she had locked away the flag, the same way she had locked away the memory of carrying James Halloway across 3 kilometers of fire-scorched earth with his left leg nearly severed above the knee, his call sign tattooed on his forearm now while his brain injury kept him from ever remembering her face. But something had shifted in her chest when Mercer had spoken. Not anger. Not fear. Something quieter than that. Something colder. Something that understood, with absolute clarity, that the mask she wore in this hospital, the quiet competence, the deferential acceptance, the invisible nurse, had an expiration date. It was only a matter of time before the two versions of herself collided in a space too small to contain them both. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. She only knew that when it happened, it was going to be decisive. Thursday morning at Cedar Creek Medical began like every other Thursday, fluorescent lights humming their electrical drone, the smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing into something that tasted like resignation. Grand round started at 0800 sharp. 12 residents filed into the conference room, tablets glowing like prayer candles in their hands, and Hannah sat in the back row because that's where nurses Saturday. That's where people who didn't belong Saturday. Dr. Mercer stood at the projector, his Italian loafers polished to a mirror shine, his white coat pristine in a way that suggested he never actually touched patients. He clicked to the first slide. Hannah's personnel file appeared on the screen, magnified for the entire room to see. Her name. Her hire date. Her medication logs. "Nurse Clarke," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, controlled, dangerous. He didn't look at her yet. He was building toward it. 1847 hours, April 14th, morphine administration. 2 milligrams for push for our post-surgical patient in bed 4. Hannah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands remained perfectly still on her notepad. The order arrived at the nurse's station at 1847 and 15 seconds, Mercer continued, clicking to another slide showing the timestamp. The medication was already in the patient's bloodstream. 15 seconds. Prior. Does anyone see the issue here? A resident raised his hand. Mercer smiled, that particular smile that people who'd never served noticed he used when he was about to make someone smaller. The nurse, Mercer said, administered a controlled substance without a physician's written authorization. She anticipated my order. Or perhaps she simply knew better. That's what I call dangerous freelancing. The residents laughed. Soft, uncertain laughter. The kind that comes from people who weren't quite sure if they should be laughing but didn't want to stand alone. Hannah wrote something on her notepad. The tip of her pen didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady, the kind of steady that came from Bagram, from situations where shaking meant dying. Notice the pattern, Mercer said, clicking through slide after slide. February. A pain medication administered for minutes before my order. March. An antibiotic ordered at 0300, but our nurse Clarke saw fit to start it at 0256. She seems to believe her 2 years of nursing school, he paused here, letting the contempt season every syllable, trump my 15 years of medical education. One of the residents smiled. Hannah saw it out of her peripheral vision. She didn't look up. This is what happens when we mistake confidence for competence, Mercer said. He turned toward the back of the room, and now his eyes found hers. This is what happens when someone with limited training believes they understand medicine better than someone with actual credentials. One might call it intuition. I call it practicing medicine without a license. And in this hospital, it stops now. The silence that followed tasted like copper. Hannah closed her notepad, stood up smoothly, and walked out of the conference room without acknowledging him. Behind her, she heard Mercer continue speaking, but his words had become background noise. She'd learned a long time ago that the things people said about you while you were leaving didn't matter. It was what they said when you turned around that mattered. The morning dragged on like a wounded animal. 12 hours of ICU rotations, 12 hours of knowing that every medication she administered would be questioned, every clinical decision scrutinized, every moment of her time at Cedar Creek Medical now marked with the invisible stamp of someone who thought she was better than she was. By afternoon, Hannah needed water. She needed a moment that wasn't supervised. The vending machine on the third floor was always empty of everyone. She'd learned its schedule during her first week. 1,445 hours meant the hallway would be clear for exactly 7 minutes before the shift change brought traffic. She was wrong. Dr. Mercer stood there with 4 interns clustered around him like planets around a sun, and he was speaking just loudly enough for his voice to carry. He saw her coming and his eyes tracked her like a predator that had already decided to feed. Some people confuse confidence with competence, he said, his gaze locked on hers as she approached the machine. They think because patients respond well to them, because they seem to care, that they actually understand medicine. But caring isn't science. Confidence isn't competence. Hannah inserted her coins. The machine hummed. The water bottle descended with mechanical precision. Medicine requires credentials, Mercer continued, turning slightly so the interns could see his profile, his strong jaw, his undeniable authority. It requires actual training. Not just a bleeding heart and a stethoscope. Not just the ability to hold a hand while a patient dies. She opened the water bottle. The plastic crinkled. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. Next time you see someone practicing beyond their scope, Mercer said, speaking to his interns now but still making sure she could hear every word, report it. Don't protect them. Don't enable them. Report it. Hannah drank half the bottle in one pull. She turned and walked away from the vending machine, from Dr. Mercer, from the interns who didn't yet understand that authority and competence were 2 different things. She didn't look back. She didn't give him the satisfaction. But that afternoon became evening, and evening meant 1,630 hours meant the ICU halls began to empty. Hannah stood outside the locked doors of the critical care unit, charting vitals on the patient whose file she'd been assigned to monitor, the intelligence asset, the reason her real orders had brought her to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place. She could see the monitors through the safety glass. Blood pressure stable. O2 sat 94%. Another day in recovery. Footsteps behind her. She knew before she turned around. She could hear it in the gate, the particular confidence of a man who'd never learned that not every hallway was a place to prove dominance. A word, Nurse Clarke, Dr. Mercer said. His voice had dropped to something quieter now, which made it worse. Quiet voices meant private consequences. Quiet voices meant threats. Hannah turned. He was close enough that she could see the exact shade of his cologne, something expensive that couldn't hide the sweat beneath it. He was worked up about her. That was interesting. Your little cowgirl routine ends now, he whispered. His emphasis on cowgirl made it sound like the worst thing she could be. I've been documenting every medication you've administered for the past 4 months. Every deviation from protocol. Every time you thought you knew better than me. Next time you circumvent my authority, I'll have security escort you out in front of everyone. I'll make sure every hospital in Denver knows exactly why you can't be trusted. Do we understand each other? Hannah met his eyes. 2 seconds. Long enough to show she'd heard him. Long enough to show she'd remembered. Not long enough to challenge him, not here, not now. She nodded once. Just once. Good, he said, and he walked away before she could do something he'd regret. She finished her shift at 2,147 hours. The evening had cooled Denver down to 48 degrees, and the parking garage was empty except for her 2003 Civic and the echo of her footsteps. She sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, the cold air rushing in, and reached into her locker. the locker that held the things she was supposed to forget about. The flag came out first. It was folded into a triangle the way they always folded them, tight and precise, the edges sharp enough to cut. It was from a casket. Not hers. It belonged to someone else who'd been wearing the same uniform, the same boots, the same certainty that they'd walk out of Bagram Airfield at the end of the deployment. They hadn't. Hannah unfolded it slowly. The fabric was old, 2009 vintage, from a war that nobody wanted to remember anymore. She let herself remember. Exactly 60 seconds. That's what she allowed herself. 1 minute to think about Sanjin Valley. 1 minute to think about the mountains that came down so fast they sounded like thunder. 1 minute to think about hands that couldn't hold on anymore. At 59 seconds, she folded the flag back up. Military precision. Sharp edges. Contained. She locked it away again in the locker, the same way she locked away everything else that couldn't survive daylight. Across town, 42 miles from Cedar Creek Medical, in a Veterans Affairs facility in the northeast section of Denver, a man sat in a wheelchair on a supervised porch, the Colorado summer behind him now, autumn coming fast. His name was David Holloway, though most people just called him Gator when his brain still worked right. He couldn't remember her face anymore. The IED had taken most things, actually. His short-term memory. His ability to walk. His future as anything other than what he was now, a man in a wheelchair, staring at nothing, with a call sign tattooed on his forearm in military stencil font. Sierra 6. That was her. The forearm tattoo was the only thing he had left of her. The IED had taken his memory of pulling her from the burning Humvee. It had taken his memory of the 120-mile convoy they'd run to get her to forward operating base Shank alive. It had taken his memory of her face entirely, that had been the first thing to go, the neurologist said, the most traumatic memories burned away like scar tissue that wouldn't hold. But the tattoo remained. A name he couldn't match to a person. A rank he couldn't remember serving under. A reminder of someone he'd loved but would never recognize again. He sat in his wheelchair and watched the Colorado afternoon fade into evening, and somewhere inside his fractured brain, something that had once been a Marine tried to remember who Sierra 6 was and couldn't. Across the city, Anna Clarke sat in her car and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of grief before she locked that away too, alongside the flag, alongside Bagram, alongside everything she'd sacrificed to become someone nobody recognized anymore. Tuesday evening arrived like every other Tuesday, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song, the antiseptic smell coating everything like a second skin. Hannah Clarke sat at the nurse's station reviewing charts when the doors exploded inward at 18:47 hours. A man. 300 pounds of muscle and rage and chemicals, his pupils blown wide enough to see the violence swimming behind them. PCP. Had to be. The screaming started before his boots hit the tile, incoherent, animal sounds that made the waiting room freeze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He lurched toward the front desk, his massive frame knocking over a chair like it weighed nothing, and that's when he saw her. A pregnant woman sitting in the second row of chairs, 8 months at least, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. He didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed her shoulder and shoved. She hit the linoleum hard. The sound of her body striking the floor echoed through the ER like a starting pistol, and Hannah was moving before conscious thought could catch up with her. The intruder was already advancing toward the nurse's station, his eyes locked on nothing in particular, just rage and stimulus and whatever was burning through his neural pathways. His fingers closed around a metal chair, chrome and vinyl, the kind that usually sat in the waiting area, and he hoisted it above his head with casual violence. The chair rose like a weapon. Like an axe about to fall. Like the moment before everything changed. Someone screamed. A nurse dove sideways. The attending physician froze mid-stride, 20 feet away, too far to do anything but watch. The security guards fumbled with their radios, useless, slow, bureaucratic. They would never make it in time. The chair was already at the apex of its swing, already beginning its descent toward the nurses' station where 3 staff members stood paralyzed. One of those nurses was Hannah Clarke. Muscle memory is the body's way of remembering what the mind has been trained to forget. It lives in the tendons and synapses, in the lightning-fast reflexes that are born from 10,000 repetitions in training compounds across 3 continents. It lives in hands that have held weapons in the dark and eyes that have read threats in the space between heartbeats. Bagram taught her to move before thinking, to act before the conscious mind could whisper its doubts. The intruder's feet were planted too wide. His center of gravity was high because the chair was heavy and his arms were extended, which meant he was committed to the swing, which meant he had zero ability to adjust once motion began. Hannah stepped left, not away, but toward him, crossing the path of the descending chair by less than 12 inches. The metal whistled past her ear so close she felt the displacement of air, felt the physics of violence passing close enough to kill. His momentum was immense, his weight already transferred forward. He couldn't stop. Couldn't redirect. Couldn't do anything but continue falling into the space where his target had been a millisecond before. Her hands moved on their own. Right hand caught his wrist, the arm holding the chair, and she twisted it inward using his own velocity as the engine of the throw. Textbook judo mechanics mixed with something darker, something learned in rooms where there were no rules and the only lesson that mattered was survival. His body followed his arm because physics demanded it. His massive frame rotated, off balance, and she pivoted into him, using his 300-pound mass like he was a practice dummy. His face met the linoleum first. Then his shoulder. Then his arm, which she hyperextended just past the point of consciousness, keeping him pinned with a joint lock that left no room for movement or negotiation. 43 seconds had elapsed from the moment the door opened to the moment he hit the floor. Not 44. Not 45. 43, because in the army, precision in violence was the difference between coming home and flag folded at Arlington. He stayed face down on that linoleum, his breathing shallow and panicked, his arm screaming in pain, unable to move because moving would shatter the socket. Hannah's expression never changed. No adrenaline. No triumph. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was controlled. She looked like someone who had just folded a fitted sheet, not someone who had just neutralized a lethal threat in under 4 seconds while security guards were still processing what their eyes had seen. The pregnant woman was still on the ground. That was priority 1. Everything else could wait. Hannah released the intruder's arm slowly, keeping pressure on his wrist as security finally arrived and secured his other limbs with restraints. She was already moving toward the woman, already scanning for injuries, her tactical mind shifting seamlessly into medical mode. The pregnant woman's eyes were wide with terror, her hands cradling her belly, her breathing shallow. No visible lacerations. Pupils reactive. The monitor on her chest showed normal sinus rhythm. No signs of placental abruption, not yet anyway. Hannah knelt beside her without touching, keeping her hands visible and gentle. You're safe now. I'm going to help you up. Nice and slow. We'll get you to a bed and check on your baby. Her voice dropped to register, deeper than the timid nurse voice she used for Mercer, but still measured, still professional. She was giving an order, but the woman would hear it as care. That was the gift of being underestimated. You learn to hide strength in gentleness. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Hannah helped her stand with the kind of steadiness that came from having held others through far worse than a fall. They were moving toward Trauma Bay 2 when she heard the footsteps. Dr. Mercer stood in the ER doorway, his arms crossed, his expression a dark calculation. He had watched the entire incident, the chair, the takedown, the flawless execution. Hannah felt his stare like a target laser, tracking her as she guided the pregnant woman to a bed and began the standard assessment. Blood pressure 118/72. Elevated from stress but not dangerous. Heart rate 94. Respiration 16. All within normal parameters. The woman was intact. The baby was intact. The threat was neutralized. But Mercer's eyes told a different story. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't grateful. He was watching Hannah with the focused intensity of a man who had just witnessed something that contradicted everything he believed about the woman in front of him. A nurse didn't move like that. A nurse didn't drop a 300-pound man with surgical precision. A nurse didn't display the kind of tactical awareness that came from training in environments where mistakes meant body bags. She could feel his mind working through it, trying to file her back into the category he had built for her, just a nurse, overstepping, dangerous, out of control. But there was a flicker of something else there too. Doubt. Confusion. The first crack in a certainty he had built over months of contempt. Hannah hooked the pregnant woman up to a fetal monitor, the rhythmic whoosh of the baby's heartbeat filling the bay, strong and steady, and that's when the doors burst open again. The 17-year-old boy from the car accident was being wheeled in on a stretcher by paramedics, his breathing labored, his left shoulder caved inward at an angle that made no anatomical sense. Tracheal deviation. Hannah's eyes registered the signs instantly, the asymmetrical chest rise, the absent breath sounds on the right side, the bluish tint creeping into his lips despite the oxygen mask the paramedics had strapped to his face. Tension pneumothorax. His collapsed lung was creating positive pressure in his chest cavity, and that pressure was pushing his heart and great vessels toward the opposite side of his body. He had maybe 90 seconds before the heart shifted too far and stopped pumping altogether. After that, no amount of intervention would matter. She was moving before she consciously decided to move, already calling out vitals to the resident who had just rushed into the bay. Oxygen sat 74 and falling. Heart rate 148. BP 102/70. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, midline, second intercostal space. The resident, a young woman named Chen, nodded and scrambled for supplies. But then Mercer appeared in the doorway again, and his voice cut through the urgency like a blade. Nobody touches that patient until Dr. Reynolds arrives. That's a direct order. His eyes found Hannah. Nobody. The 17-year-old boy on stretcher 3 wasn't breathing right, and Hannah knew it before anyone spoke. His chest rose in jagged, asymmetrical movements, the left side expanding, the right staying flat as concrete. The ER had shifted into controlled chaos around him, residents calling vitals, nurses cutting away his clothes, but Hannah moved past all of it like water flowing around stone, her eyes tracking the deviation in his trachea, the absence of breath sounds on the right side, the oxygen saturation numbers dropping on the monitor like a stone into a well, 94, 91, 88. Car accident on I-25. He'd been ejected. Blunt force trauma to the chest. The EKG tech was still hooking leads when Hannah's hands found the ultrasound probe, her movements economical and precise, scanning the right hemithorax in 3 seconds flat. There, the collapsed lung. Air where lung should be. Tension pneumothorax building pressure against his heart, and if nobody decompressed that space in the next 90 seconds, this kid's heart would stop altogether. Needle decompression, Hannah said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. The resident looked up from his tablet. We should wait for the attending to. His oxygen dropped to 84. Hannah was already moving, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory from Bagram taking over, from a forward operating base where a Marine corporal had taken shrapnel to the lung and died waiting for someone to ask permission. She had the kit open before the resident finished his sentence, a 14-gauge angiocath needle with a syringe attached, the plastic wrapper already split, her palm steady as a surgical laser as she palpated the landmarks with her left hand and advanced the needle with her right. The skin gave. Fascia. Pleural space. And then. The hiss of air escaping. Sinus rhythm. The boy's chest heaved like he'd been holding his breath underwater and suddenly surfaced. His oxygen saturation climbed like something alive, like it was clawing its way back to the world, 84, 88, 92, 96. The trachea shifted back toward midline. His lips went from that particular shade of death grey to something resembling human. But that wasn't the worst part for Hannah. That wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came when she looked up and saw Dr. Mercer standing in the doorway like a carved monument, his face an architectural drawing of contempt, his eyes moving from her hands to the needle to the boy's recovering color, and she watched understanding bloom across his face like a bruise, understanding that she had just violated scope of practice, that she had done something a nurse had no legal authority to do, that she had saved a teenager's life using a procedure restricted to physicians and advanced practitioners, and that he now had exactly what he needed. She met his gaze for 2 seconds, returned her attention to the boy. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. By 0600 Wednesday morning, the complaint letter was in the HR system. Hannah sat in the administrator's office at 0830, looking at the suspension notice sliding across the desk like a playing card. The paper was light, almost weightless, the kind of thing that should be inconsequential, except it carried her clearance and her mission and everything she'd been trying to hold together. Her classified assignment monitoring the former intelligence asset in ICU bed 347, the CIA operative recovering from suspected polonium poisoning, required eyes on him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Someone had to document every visitor, every conversation, every phone call. Someone had to watch for the assassins who would come eventually. Now it wouldn't be her. The footage is clear, the administrator said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Dr. Mercer's complaint about the Intruder incident shows you using excessive force. And the needle decompression, that's beyond nursing scope, Captain. Whatever your intentions. She didn't correct him. Didn't explain that her intentions were keeping a 17-year-old alive. Didn't mention that the boy had been 10 seconds away from cardiac arrest when she moved. Just nodded once, removed her hospital badge, set it on the desk with a soft plastic click. Her locker was in the staff room at the end of the north corridor, the one with the broken latch and the half-melted motivational poster about teamwork. She used her personal key, the badge wouldn't work anymore, and opened the door to find her entire life compressed into 40 cubic inches of metal. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from the pediatric ICU staff 2 years ago. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, brown and papery, which she'd forgotten to water between shifts. And a photo in a silver frame, 5 soldiers in full combat gear at forward operating base Shank, her arm around a corporal named Martinez, all of them alive in that image, all of them believing they were invincible. Martinez had died 4 days later during the ambush. So had Sergeant Quinn. So had their interpreter, Habib, who had 2 daughters and wanted to own a restaurant. She held the frame for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge, then placed it in the cardboard box the security guard had given her. Added the mug. Added the succulent. Added the folded flag she kept in the back, the one from Martinez's funeral, the one that smelled like Arlington Cemetery and goodbye. She carried the box through the ER at 09:15 in the morning, and every eye that looked at her slid away. The morning shift staff didn't know her well enough to ask questions. The night shift staff who did know her just stared down at their paperwork. Nobody said anything. Nobody called after her. The rain started as she pushed through the double doors, the kind of rain that falls in Denver in spring, cold, relentless, suggesting that winter wasn't actually finished with you yet. The bus stop on Colfax was a metal shelter with a plastic roof that leaked from the corner, and Hannah sat on the bench where the water collected in a small pool. Her phone had buzzed twice with a Pentagon number, her handler, probably, now getting information that a federal asset had just lost her cover at Cedar Creek Medical. The classified operation was burned. The mission was compromised. The intelligence asset in ICU bed 347 was now vulnerable to whoever had been trying to kill him. And it was her fault. Because she couldn't walk past a teenage boy with a collapsed lung. She didn't answer the phone. The rain hammered the plastic roof like applause for a performance nobody attended. The photo of her team was beginning to curl at the edges from the moisture. Water beaded on the frame, on the glass, on their young faces, Martinez smiling, Quinn making devil horns behind someone's head, Habib throwing a peace sign at the camera. All of them erased from the world by a miscalculation on a mission that went wrong in 3 seconds and wrong in the wrong direction. The bus shelter leaked in the corner where she sat, a patient drip that hit the metal frame and echoed like a metronome counting down. Her clearance was evaporating somewhere in a Pentagon office. Her security credential was being rescinded through automated channels she couldn't see or control. The veteran she'd carried through a kill zone in Kandahar, his name was Morgan, she'd heard later, from letters he sent to the unit, was still in a wheelchair at a VA facility somewhere, his traumatic brain injury having erased the face of the woman who'd kept him alive long enough to medevac. Her call sign was tattooed on his forearm in letters his own brain would never translate back into memory. And now she'd thrown away her entire operational position because a 17-year-old was dying. She should have waited. Should have called a code. Should have let someone else decompress the pneumothorax after the attending arrived. Should have played by rules that killed people slowly and quietly instead of saving them in violation of every regulation written. The rain fell harder. The photo was getting soaked. She placed it in her jacket instead, against her chest, where her heart was still beating in the pattern of someone whose hands had held lives together and was now watching everything she'd built collapse into the same gravity well that had consumed Martinez. Her phone buzzed again. Pentagon. She watched it light up, her hand steady, her breathing measured, her composure intact even though every classified thing in her life had just been detonated. The bus pulled up on Colfax, its brakes hissing like the pneumothorax needle, and she watched it arrive without boarding. Watched it leave without her. The rain kept falling. Somewhere in the ICU, the intelligence asset she couldn't protect was still breathing, still vulnerable, still unguarded. Somewhere in her personnel file, Dr. Mercer's complaint was being investigated by people who would never understand that she'd violated protocol to prevent death, not to create it. The military had taught her precision, discipline, and the ability to function in chaos, but nothing they'd taught her had prepared her for the moment when keeping rules meant letting people die, and breaking rules meant losing everything. She sat in the rain at a bus stop in Denver, holding a cardboard box containing the only physical evidence that she had ever been anyone but just a nurse, watching her clearance and her mission circle the drain because she couldn't just let someone die. Thursday morning at 9:45, the hospital lobby doors hissed open and Ethan Clarke walked through like he was carrying a grenade in his backpack. 14 years old, 5'9", growing into shoulders that looked more military with each passing month, he'd inherited his mother's patience and his father's defiance, which meant he'd been sitting on this plan for exactly 36 hours. The backpack clinked. Metal on metal. Every step toward the information desk produced a sound like ammunition magazines being shifted in a rucksack, like the percussion of something catastrophic about to unfold. The lobby was busy. Cedar Creek Medical's main floor always hummed between 9 and 10, shift changes, follow-up appointments, the controlled chaos of a facility that saw 300 patients a day. Nobody noticed one teenager walking with purpose until he reached the center of the atrium, directly beneath the skylight that flooded the space with Colorado morning light, and he stopped. He turned. And he raised his voice to a parade ground projection that cut through the ambient noise like a knife through surgical mesh. "My mom was fired for saving your lives," Ethan said. "And you need to see these." The lobby didn't go silent. Not yet. There were still conversations happening, still the background percussion of hospital operations. But something shifted in the air, a pressure change, the way dogs sense earthquakes before humans feel the tremor. The information desk staff looked up. A woman waiting for her cardiologist appointment turned. The security guard near the main entrance straightened. Ethan unzipped the backpack. His hands moved with precision that looked rehearsed, because it was. He'd practiced this moment in his bedroom mirror, in the kitchen after school, in the car on the way down from their house in Capitol Hill. He lifted out a display case, one his grandfather had made from walnut wood, the kind used for military challenge coins and service medals. Inside, arranged in ascending order, were the physical evidence of everything Hannah Clarke had never told him directly: a bronze star, a silver star, 2 purple heart ribbons still attached to their original medals, the purple enamel catching the light. And in the corner, a Navy Cross in its original presentation box, the medal itself hanging from a pale blue ribbon with the distinctive white stripes. The lobby went dead silent. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a man near the west corridor, unshaven, wearing a hospital visitor's badge, sitting in a vinyl chair he'd been occupying for the past 2 weeks while his traumatic brain injury slowly rewired itself through rehabilitation therapy, went rigid. His hands, both of them, trembled. Not from weakness. From recognition. His eyes locked on the Navy Cross like it was a door to a place he'd been trapped outside, screaming to get back in. "Sierra 6, the man whispered. His voice wasn't loud. It was the opposite, so quiet it required the absolute silence of the atrium to penetrate. But it did. Those two words traveled through the acoustic space of the lobby like a radio frequency suddenly finding its broadcast tower. A veteran recognizing a call sign. A survivor remembering the person who'd pulled him out of Sanjin Valley with rounds still impacting the stone wall 2 feet above her head. He stood. His left leg didn't track perfectly. Traumatic brain injury affected his proprioception, made his balance compensate through effort, but he moved toward Ethan with the determination of someone being pulled by gravity toward truth. He reached the display case. His scarred fingers, knuckles fused wrong from old compound fractures, moved toward the Navy Cross but didn't touch. Not yet. He read the citation card beneath the medal, his lips forming words as his eyes tracked. Then he read it aloud. His voice started at normal volume and built, expanded, became something larger than one man's breath. It became a parade ground voice, the kind developed through years of military protocol and combat communication, the kind that travels 300 meters across an open field. His voice became a transmission, and the lobby became a cathedral, and he read Hannah Clarke's Navy Cross citation like it was scripture. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. On 23 May, in Helmand Province, while serving as a medic with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, while conducting combat operations in the vicinity of Sanjin Valley, the subject demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment and disregard for personal safety. When friendly forces came under effective insurgent small arms fire from a fortified position, resulting in 3 friendly casualties including the subject's team leader, the subject provided medical intervention while under direct fire, establishing a casualty collection point and treating injuries while maintaining tactical awareness of the enemy position. Upon completion of immediate care, the subject provided covering fire while the team executed tactical withdrawal through an open area, fully exposed to enemy fire from the fortified position. The subject provided continuous suppressive fire while carrying a casualty with a life-threatening extremity hemorrhage to the extraction point, crossing 170 meters of open terrain while sustaining enemy fire. The extraordinary heroism of the subject reflects great credit upon herself and the United States Armed Forces. The Marine's voice broke on the final word. His hand came up to his chest, trembling now from emotion, not injury. Tears streamed down his weathered face, the face of someone who'd been reconstructed through rehabilitation, piece by piece, whose neural pathways had been recut through months of repetition and prayer and the stubborn refusal to accept that the woman who'd saved his life should be forgotten just because his hippocampus was damaged. The lobby was transfixed. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Mercer, who was watching from 30 feet away, near the corridor that led to the attending lounge. The worst part came when he pushed forward through the crowd. He pushed between the secretary and the volunteer greeter. His white coat moved like a sail catching wind, expensive, pristine, pressed with the precision of someone for whom appearance was armor and authority was a costume that fit perfectly when nobody was asking questions. "Stolen Valor," Mercer said. His voice was loud, confrontational, designed to shatter the reverent silence that had enveloped the atrium. "That medal is stolen or fabricated. This child is committing federal fraud on hospital grounds." He reached for the display case. Ethan didn't move. The veteran didn't move. But the moment extended, elastic with tension, and everyone in the lobby sensed it, the collision between institutional power trying to exercise dominion and truth trying to exist in the physical world. That's when the general stepped forward. 2-star general, silver eagles on his shoulder boards, dress uniform that carried the weight of 42 years of commissioned service. He'd been in the lobby for his daughter's pre-op appendectomy evaluation, waiting in the surgical wing chairs, when he heard the Marine's voice reading the citation. He'd risen. He'd walked toward the sound of a call sign he recognized from a classified operation 7 years earlier. He'd walked toward the display case. And now he stood between Dr. Mercer and the evidence of Hannah Clarke's existence as a warrior. His uniform moved like a living thing, the fabric speaking its own language of authority and precision. His hands came up to the display case, gloved in white cotton, trembling not from emotion but from the ceremonial respect of a soldier honoring a soldier. His right hand moved in a salute, the kind that comes from the center of the chest, the kind that says, "I see you, I know what you've done, I am witnessed by the same code that witnessed you." "Brigadier General Michael Stewards," he said. His voice was quiet but absolute, like the voice that would command a battalion to advance into fire. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3rd Battalion. Captain Clarke served under my command. This citation is accurate. And you, Doctor, are standing in the presence of a hero, and you don't have the clearance to be standing here at all. The general's eyes turned to face Mercer with the flat, appraising gaze of someone evaluating a threat assessment. In that moment, Mercer was no longer a doctor at Cedar Creek Medical. He was a security risk. He was a complication. He was a problem that the military intelligence apparatus had just been made aware of. The lobby didn't just go quiet. The lobby seemed to stop existing as normal physical space. The hum of the HVAC system became audible. The fluorescent lights buzzed with renewed presence. A door somewhere in the building creaked on its hinges. Mercer's jaw clenched. His right hand, which had been reaching for the display case, fell to his side. The color drained from his face in stages, first the cheeks, then the lips, then the visible skin of his neck. He'd just been identified by a federal officer as a security concern at a location where classified military operations had apparently been conducted. He'd just tried to interfere with evidence of a Black Ops mission. He'd just attempted to discredit someone under military protection. He turned and walked back toward the corridor, his white coat moving like a flag of surrender. The lobby filled with sound again, conversation resuming, the ambient noise of normalcy re-establishing itself, but something fundamental had shifted. The power structure that had sustained Mercer's authority in this building, his ability to humiliate and threaten with impunity, had been revealed as an illusion. Thin. Fragile. Ultimately irrelevant in the face of actual institutional power. Within the hour, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Cedar Creek Medical's administrative office. Not military. Federal. Pentagon liaisons, the kind of people who operated in the spaces between hospital governance and classified operations. They requested the hospital administrator's presence. They requested Dr. Mercer's personnel file. They requested his credentialing documentation from Johns Hopkins Medical School. What they found made both men's expressions tighten in a precise way that precedes a crisis of institutional liability. The Pentagon liaisons presented their findings to the administrator with surgical precision. Captain Clarke's nursing position had been a sanctioned federal operation, conducted under cooperative agreement with Cedar Creek Medical's parent corporation. The classification level was compartmentalized, need to know only, which meant the administrator himself hadn't been cleared for the details. But the operation was legitimate. The captain was legitimate. The investigation Dr. Mercer had launched against her was, technically, an investigation of a federal asset operating under official sanction. Then the second revelation, which hit like a secondary explosion. Dr. Mercer's Johns Hopkins credentials. Detailed. Cross-referenced. Verified through Johns Hopkins' own personnel records, which the federal investigators accessed through proper channels at FBI request. Dr. Mercer had never completed his residency. He'd been terminated in his second year, 2004, for gross negligence in patient care. A medication error that led to patient harm. A cover-up. A decision by Johns Hopkins to issue a quiet termination rather than report to the medical board, a decision that they'd later regret when federal investigators started asking questions about why those records had been omitted from his credentialing application for Colorado licensure. The administrator's hands began to shake. The Pentagon liaisons explained, with the courtesy of federal officers speaking to a civilian, that Dr. Mercer's falsified credentials and his investigation of Captain Clarke, an investigation that had generated documented security violations and interference with a classified operation, would be referred to the Colorado Medical Board, the Denver District Attorney's Office, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The liaisons estimated that the administrator had approximately 48 hours before subpoenas began arriving. They were correct, almost to the hour. The Colorado Medical Board moved with the precision of an institution suddenly aware that credentialing fraud in one of their physicians reflected on their entire licensing authority. They subpoenaed Mercer's file. They discovered not just the falsified Johns Hopkins credentials, but a trail of manipulated patient records stretching back through his entire career at Cedar Creek. 3 documented cases of patient harm, each one buried through strategic documentation. Attending signatures that weren't authentic. Medication orders that didn't match actual pharmacy records. The architecture of a medical career built on deception. His edited security footage of Hannah's takedown, the footage he'd created to make her look excessive, to make her look like a threat, was reviewed by actual security experts. The frame manipulation became obvious. The digital artifacts appeared when enhanced. The timestamp inconsistencies revealed themselves. Evidence tampering. Adding conspiracy charges to the growing list. Within a week, the medical board revoked his license permanently. Within 2 weeks, the hospital terminated him for cause, which voided his severance contract and pension. Within a month, the Denver District Attorney's Office filed charges for fraud and endangerment. His wife filed for divorce, citing the financial devastation and humiliation. The residents he'd cultivated, the interns who'd laughed at his mockery of Hannah, began distancing themselves publicly, making statements about how they'd always questioned his judgment. 6 months later, a private investigator photographed Mercer in a strip mall classroom at Denver Community College, wearing a polo shirt with the college logo. He was teaching CPR certification classes. Demonstrating chest compressions on a practice dummy to a class of bored high school students fulfilling health requirements. Earning $18 per hour. His hands trembled when he performed the technique, a tremor that hadn't been there before, the physical manifestation of a nervous system processing the loss of everything. The investigator noted in his report that Mercer sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared out the window, as if still processing how a single moment, reaching for a medal he didn't have clearance to touch, had dismantled 30 years of professional architecture. Hannah returned to Cedar Creek Medical not as Nurse Clarke, but as Captain Clarke, United States Army Special Forces, serving as a clinical liaison while her classified mission closed and the intelligence asset she'd been monitoring provided testimony that dismantled a foreign network attempting to establish presence in the Western Hemisphere. The Pentagon formally recognized her service in the ER, the emergency needle decompression that violated scope of practice but saved a life, as consistent with her training and authorization as a military medical officer operating in civilian medical environments. The pregnant woman from the attack sent Hannah a photograph. A healthy newborn, 7 pounds 2 ounces, born without complications. A note in careful handwriting, "You saved us both." The teenager with the tension pneumothorax was discharged fully recovered, his neural pathways still firing perfectly, his lungs still expanding with the breath that Hannah had preserved through precise needle placement at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. His parents visited Hannah to thank the woman who'd ignored orders to save their son. The folded flag from her fallen teammate's casket, the flag Hannah had carried in isolation, locked away in her locker, mourned in 60-second increments in her car, was now displayed in the staff lounge beneath a brass plaque reading Captain Hannah Clarke, U.S. Army Special Forces. Courage under fire. The Marine with Sierra 6 tattooed on his forearm, that visible declaration of loyalty on his skin, the scar tissue of ink over damaged nerve endings, began experimental treatment that slowly rewired fragments of memory. He didn't remember her face yet. Not completely. But he remembered the firefight. He remembered extraction. He remembered someone carrying him when he couldn't walk, moving through terrain that should have killed him, moving with the kind of strength that only exists when everything else has been burned away. Hannah visited him monthly at the VA facility in North Denver. They sat together in the rehabilitation wing, the Marine and the captain, and sometimes he pointed to his tattoo and asked what it meant, and she told him, and by the next visit he'd forgotten again, and she told him again, because that's what loyalty meant. That's what mission meant. That's what the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself meant. Her new office desk, Pentagon had given her a clinical research position studying combat trauma care, studying how operators with hidden capabilities function within civilian medical systems, studying the next generation of soldiers who might need to save lives in impossible spaces, held a single framed photograph. Ethan standing beside the Marine. Both of them smiling finally. The tattoo visible on the Marine's arm. The kind of image that required no explanation to anyone who'd ever worn a uniform, because it contained everything that mattered: the connection, the survival, the acknowledgement that some bonds transcend the fragility of human memory. She kept the cracked mug on her bookshelf. The one that said "World's Okayest Nurse." A reminder that the best operators are the ones nobody sees coming, the ones who push through hospital corridors and shift changes and institutional contempt, the ones whose hands don't shake when they're doing what matters most. And when she led the training session for Cedar Creek's emergency nurses, when she stood in the conference room teaching them the same techniques that had dropped a 300-pound intruder in 4 seconds, the same tactical awareness that had kept her classification intact for 5 years, the same discipline that had allowed her to walk away from Dr. Mercer's contempt without breaking, her voice was steady. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she told the nurses. They practiced joint locks while Hannah watched. Her left hand trembled slightly, the tremor that comes from carrying too much for too long, then steadied as it always did. As it would always do. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.